I'm going to give you a kind of general overview of my book, and then I'm going to make some comments about some of the therapeutic issues that are embedded in the story, and then I really look forward to your questions. The book is something of a multiple personality. I mean, it's non-fiction, but it reads like a novel, and it's an intimate family memoir, but it's also this sweeping piece of Canadian medical and psychiatric history. I also like to call it a self-murder mystery, which I've written it like a mystery story, and so which I will explain later without revealing the mystery. At another level, the book can be seen as a kind of multi-generational case history and a psychiatric cautionary tale, which I hope we can all learn from. On the cover of the book, you'll see a 3-year-old boy who happens to be myself, and I'm standing on the front lawn of my grandfather's house on Balmoral Avenue in Toronto, and the house was built in 1914 by my grandfather, Jerry FitzGerald, who was an eminent doctor of international stature, but he died 10 years before I was born. And his son, my father, Jack, grew up in the same house in the 20s, so my brother, sister, and I were the third generation to occupy this house. And as you can see from the vexed expression on my face, I'm already the little detective on the case, because growing up, no one ever spoke of my grandfather. It was as if he didn't exist. And so I think I was already channeling the Irish ghosts. When I was 7 years old, the family moved north into Forest Hill onto Dunvegan Road, and my father, Jack, was now pioneering clinical immunology and allergy in the city at the Western Hospital, teaching at U of T. He had his own private allergy extract lab, so his career was really taking off. And the man sitting beside him is Dr. John Hamilton, who was a future dean of medicine, and he's an important character in this story later on. So here we are in the 60s, living in a beautiful neighborhood, swimming pool, private educations, fabulous, the good life. And I should tell you, from medical school onward, my father was a passionate jazz fan. He used to, when he was a young man, have the entire Duke Ellington band back to the house on Balmoral for all-night marijuana parties. And he would occasionally prescribe his musician friends a little narcotic on the side. So, but this too, I never heard from him. This is, I heard this later, but certainly not from him. So by the 60s, in the 60s when I hit my teens, suddenly everything started to unravel. First, my father had a nervous sort of midlife crisis, nervous collapse. Then he fell into a severe depression, and he made 2 suicide attempts by injecting morphine. And the second attempt, my sister Sheila found him, and just sort of in the nick of time. There's no question that if she had not found him, he would certainly have died. And fortunately, I was out of the house at the time. I was away at Queen's. But my brother and mother were up north, so Sheila was alone. And I'm going to read you a very dramatic passage in the book of what happened on this traumatic day in 1970. At this point, Sheila has rushed my father to the hospital. "What did your father take?" comes the voice of the ER doctor. "He's dying. We need to know so we can give him the antidote." But how could Sheila possibly know? And so, as the father hovers on the edge of endless night, the trapped daughter calls the mother at the country retreat, and as the tall white coats and hanging stethoscopes ring her in a circle of urgent expectation, from the far end of the line comes the familiar voice, the voice of the long disaffected housewife, locked in a state of unholy acrimony, the failed artist, the mother who had calmly orchestrated her firstborn child to face the crazy music in her stead, and the cold, flat note of a single word in all of its inevitability, morphine. As the doctors rush away, a young intern slips into the glassed-in waiting room that feels like the vacuum of outer space and sits down beside Sheila, who is numb with shock and rage and guilt and shame and humiliation. "You don't seem to be too upset about your father," he observes tactlessly, a blade thrust she can only receive with stunned incomprehension. She stares at the wall where on the other side our father lies. He wants to die, and yet he wants to be saved. Yet even if his body survives, nothing in life can redeem his starving Irish spirit now. Not the best of homes in the best of neighborhoods, in the best of countries. Not the most prestigious boarding school money could buy. Not the gentle nanny gestures of his sweet Aunt Hazel, compensating for his absent parents. Not the respect of his colleagues or the affection of his friends. Not the melodic elation of Ella FitzGerald, his mad love of the Duke, nor the divine Django's virtuoso fretwork, ringed with halos of marijuana smoke. Not the cobalt blue waters of his heated swimming pool, infused by the sensuous light of the summer moon. Not the warm beige broadloom, nor the white wall tires of his gleaming Oldsmobile. Not the reflected sheen of the silver Stanley Cup, nor the blue bottles of narcotics arrayed like toy soldiers behind the mirror of the cabinet door. Not the brisk dog walks on the green grounds of Upper Canada College and the tranquil rolling hills of the countryside. Not the sweet-scented flower garden of blooming lilies, nor the sleek-necked bottles of fine red wine. Not the sugar-brown sands of Caribbean paradise, the spontaneous riffs of witty repartee, the dreamy promise of perfect orgasmic sex with a perfect, soft, smiling, loving, giving, all-surrendering wife. Not the smooth, hypnotic eye of the television screen, the clockwork flow of laugh-ins and twilight zones. Not the headlong flailings of Dr. Donald McCullough, paving the road to hell with his good intentions. None of these things, together or apart, can save the skin of Jack FitzGerald, MD, FRCP. Somehow, somewhere, deep down, he knows the score. He has not been true to himself, and there is a price to pay by us all. I think that was really, in essence, my father's tragedy. That, this is in those days that the term "follow your bliss" had not been invented, and he really should have opened a jazz clinic, not an allergy clinic. I really think that would have made an enormous difference. Over the next few years, my father was rotated through 5 different institutions, including this very building and the Clark next door, the Donwood, Homewood in Guelph, 999 Queen West. I was able to obtain his clinical files as next of kin, and they certainly do not make for happy reading. At the Donwood, the admitting psychiatrist noted, quote, "Dr. FitzGerald has enough drugs in his system to kill a horse." The long list included alcohol, amphetamines, Valium, Seconal, migraine medicine, 222s, morphine, and this is just the self-medicating. Then, of course, we get the complication of the antidepressants and the antipsychotics were now coming in. And, of course, no one could suspend his prescribing privileges because his livelihood as a doctor depended on to make a living. So 40 years ago, in the fall of 1971, my father received 10 rounds of ECT just next door here at the Clark, and the files say it produced, quote, "an adverse reaction," which sounds like a euphemism to me. My brother Michael and I, Michael's here today, I remember we visited him at the Clark exactly once, and it was a kind of a blur to me. I remember him stumbling through the corridor in his white gown and looking like Lear on the Heath and begging Mike and I to take him home. And I had actually erased that memory. Michael reminded me of it. Then he was transferred to Homewood in Guelph, and unfortunately the psychiatrist failed to consult the Clark file, and they repeated the mistake of giving him 10 more ECT, and an even worse reaction this time. And the psychiatrist in chief wrote, "Dr. FitzGerald must learn to cover up his feelings," which I simply had to use as a chapter heading. My father was a really quirky, idiopathic, idiosyncratic, jazz hipster kind of guy, like he was, like an Irish ball of mercury. He wasn't going to be pinned down into some DSM label. That was his nature. And this, of course, led to him being seen as treatment resistant. At one point at Homewood, they even suggested a lobotomy. They didn't do it, but this is in 1972. I was now of university age at Queen's, and I was starting to read Freud, among other things. But it sort of was hitting me. It seems to me like everybody was kind of ignoring the elephant in the room, you know. Surely my grandfather, Jerry, is my invisible but powerful grandfather who no one speaks about. Isn't he a factor in this story? You know, the obvious. And so one day I just went up to my mother and I asked her point blank, what's the story with Jerry? You know, did he kill himself? And I remember she just nodded. That was it. Yep. And that was no other information, how, when, where, why. And so I thought, well, okay, well, it doesn't affect me. I'm fine. I'll get on with my life. And so I'm in my 20s and 30s, and I went into journalism and book publishing. And at the time, I wasn't desperately unhappy, but I had a real sense of spinning my wheels. And it was only later that I realized it was sort of, the men in my family had reached the top of their professions, and yet they both ended up crazy and or dead. So you can understand why I might be a little success phobic, And so ever since childhood, I've been having, and right into my young adulthood, recurring dreams and often nightmares, and many of them were set at the house on Balmoral here. And so at the age of 33, belatedly, I started to seeing a psychodynamically trained lay therapist, not an MD, not a psychiatrist. And he wasn't even a psychoanalyst. He used psychoanalytical techniques and principles. Peter was particularly gifted working with dreams, and I remember we worked on almost every session. I had dreamt like crazy, and I like to say that we're all artists in our dreams. So I'm going to read the section where I first met Peter. As it turned out, I was lucky where my father wasn't. That fall of 1983, a friend of Irish Catholic blood steered me to a benign, burly psychotherapist working out of a basement office in a 3-story house in the leafy annex neighborhood of Toronto. I paid a modest fee, which I viewed as a long-term investment in my health. Peter, the Rock, was aptly named. I found him disarmingly honest and unsentimental, yet empathically and intuitively attuned, and a stringent bullshit detector leavened by a subversive sense of humor. He was a complete stranger, yet strangely, I sensed I could grow to trust him. Crucially, he was a layman, a former high school teacher trained by a community of peers, steeped in the humanistic traditions of literature, film, music, and art. After all, who better to speak of madness than Shakespeare? In our first session, Peter latched onto my Irish surname, suggesting that the legacy of my ethnicity was something I should take seriously. Everything began with my identity and my search for it. In this, I was a typical English Canadian. In our face-to-face hourly sessions, he acted as a Virgilian guide to my sealed-off underworld, an emotional midwife restoring myself piecemeal to myself. While most of my upwardly mobile peers thrashed about the golf course or squash court, I plunged downward, sifting through the tangled vines of my psychic undergrowth. With Peter, I encountered no labels or pills, no verbal psychosurgery, no fostering of dependence or kowtowing to victimhood, just the power of simple words massaging the hollow, cadaverous silence I carried deep inside me. When I learned that the word psychotherapy means soul healing, I suddenly was reminded that I had such a thing as a soul. In stark contrast to the sad, outrageous example of my father, battered from without by needle, pill, and electrode, I would eventually realize it was humanly possible to change the system, the nervous system, from within. In my 6th session, I brought in a dream that would prove uncannily prescient of my future searchings. A doctor in a white lab coat picks up a scalpel and makes a deep vertical incision down the middle of my face, forehead to chin, releasing a violent Niagara-like torrent of water. Dreams, I learned, do not yield to a single interpretation, yet this one seemed to symbolize the accumulated generations of untapped grief of which I was the contemporary carrier. And it hinted at my psychic split, the precise, ultra-rational surgical hand of schizoid Western civilization that cut my head in half at the bloody moment of my birth. An agreeable, polite, deferential Canadian persona masking my wild animal nature, my exiled Irish madman. So I found this dream unbelievably helpful. It was a kind of a template, a symbol of opening myself up to my inner life. It's now okay, James. You can look at your inner life, and you can explore these family secrets. You're not going to be killed. And at the same time, I made this kind of a miraculous discovery. I actually had something called an unconscious mind that I've been just reading about it as this abstract concept in a book, but I actually experienced it in my body. And so in concert with this sort of internal archiving weekly, I started to go out and do these external archiving, and now on this quest. And I started interviewing psychiatrists and historians and doctors, and I was on who was this mystery man, Jerry FitzGerald. And as a kid, all I had known was that he had founded a lab called CAMH. That was really all. But as I dug deeper into the archives, I'm kind of astonished what I was uncovering. Here's this really remarkable character, this visionary, dynamic guy, international achievement, a real Canadian hero. I learned that he was the son of a depressed small-town apothecary and an invalid mother, which gave me a clue that helped explain, I think, his caretaking personality. He entered the U of T medical school at the precocious age of 16, the youngest ever in the history of the medical faculty. And then he just sort of took off on this remarkable career trajectory. And I'm looking at the CV, and he seemed to be in the same league as Banning and Best and Penfield and Bethune and Osler, and yet there was no biography and no real acknowledgement. And so, again, puzzled by this. And so I dug deeper, and I started to grasp the complexities of what he was doing. And just to give you a snapshot, like 100 years ago, before World War I, Toronto was really mired in third world health conditions. There was TB and typhoid and syphilis were rampant, and smallpox, infant mortality rate was something like 20%. The public health system was not, there wasn't really a system to speak of. And just to pick one example, diphtheria was this gruesome disease that killed thousands of kids every year, decades in, decades out. A membrane choked the kid, and the parents watched helplessly. And if you were rich, if you were wealthy, and you were lucky, you could import an American antitoxin that was still pretty crude. And it might save your kid, it might not. But so it ended up that the vast majority of kids had just died because they couldn't afford it, and the families couldn't afford it. And so for 3 very intense years, from 1910 to 1913, Jerry is sort of a man on a mission, and he trains here that's the Pasteur Institute. He wasn't that thin, the pictures. So he travels at the Pasteur Institute, and he goes to Berkeley and Harvard and all these elite institutions, and he's training himself. And then he comes back to the U of T in 1913 with his kind of flaming sword, and he has this very passionate idea, which he pitches to U of T, and he says, listen, I will personally make low-cost, high-quality vaccines and antitoxins across a whole range of diseases, and we're going to distribute them free to the poor, and we're going to do it here at U of T. And this was sort of unprecedented because an academic institution did not get involved in the commercial production of drugs. So this is a brand new idea. And to their credit, U of T bought the idea, and the CAMH labs were born May 1st, 1914. Then we get this sort of series of lucky historical accidents. World War II breaks out just a few months later, and there's a pressing need to inoculate thousands of troops on the Western Front. So who steps forward but the philanthropist Albert Gooderham of the Gooderham and Worts Distillery Empire. He's impressed with this young doctor. He gives him 50 acres of land up at Dufferin and Steeles, free. The CAMH Labs farm, building, money, labs, go, And so now they're pumping out millions of doses of stuff for the troops. So that gives the lab an early boost. And then there's a second historical accident when only 7 years later, in 1922, Jerry's friends Banning and Best are making this miraculous discovery of insulin just 2 floors above his head in the medical building. And so now here's my grandfather scrambling to refine and mass-produce insulin for millions of the world's diabetics. Toronto is suddenly cast in the international spotlight. The fledgling lab is under all this pressure. And insulin would prove to be only one feather in the cap of the lab. Concurrent with this, Jerry and his team are systematically wiping out diphtheria over a period of years, and other diseases are reducing. And Toronto and Hamilton become the first cities in the world diphtheria-free. London, New York, still stricken with this stuff. So, by the 1920s, the Rockefeller Foundation, medical philanthropist in New York, are noticing all this. What are these hayseeds doing up in Toronto, that we aren't? And So Rockefeller donates a lot of money to my grandfather and to the U of T to build a school of hygiene just down the road here at 150 College Street. And this is only the third school of public health in North America after Harvard and Johns Hopkins. And this is now essentially the academic arm of the lab. So now we have research, teaching, and manufacturing of drugs all under one umbrella, public service. So, and by the way, concurrently in this time, further down the street, 2 blocks, Two-Story Place, the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital is opened under Dr. C.B. Ferrer, same Rockefeller money too, and Ferrer and FitzGerald are very close friends. And they're sort of the respective leaders of their fields, public health and psychiatry. And the TPH eventually morphed into the Clark behind me in 1966. So Ferrer is a pivotal character in the book, as we'll hear. And so here, amazingly, I'm not getting the context. I'm thinking, wow, like, so before World War I, we're kind of this colonial backwater, like a third world nation in terms of public health. And within one generation, we leap to the forefront. And the Rockefellers view this school as the lighthouse school. And the Americans and Europeans are sending their best and brightest to train here. And there's sort of this golden age in the 30s now when Jerry's now Dean of Medicine, and he's revamping the medical curriculum and bringing a lot of preventive ideas in. And he's also traveling with the League of Nations. At one point, he spent 1 year visiting 25 countries, 85 medical centers, trying to get their curricula up to the Canadian standard, which is considered the gold standard. So I'm like, who knew? You know, like I had no idea. And I'm sure most Canadians didn't know either. Early in my research, I was looking at his CV and I was intrigued to learn that in his 20s, before he went into public health, he was a neuropathologist and psychiatrist at 999 Queen Street and working under C.K. Clark. And, so here, and I was able to procure from the Ontario Archives his case histories at the time, the people he was working with. This is 1907, 1908. And so here we have my grandfather, white lab coat in hand, scalpel in hand, opening up the brains of Irish lunatics, as they were called, looking for the germ of madness, because we were at the height of the bacteriological revolution. German scientists 2 years before had just found the microbe for tertiary syphilis, general precursors of the insane, so there was a lot of excitement that maybe there's a germ for each disease entity, schizophrenia, depression. And so he did that for a couple of years, but I think he got very frustrated and this isn't going anywhere. So he moves over to public health. It's interesting that when he was succeeded at Queen Street by the Freudian champion, Ernest Jones, who gave my grandfather the complete works of Freud as a medical present in 1910. Certain irony to that. And Jones went on to fail abysmally in his attempts to insinuate psychoanalysis into the Canadian medical profession. Back in '95, I had just finished my first book in Upper Canada, and I was sort of really feeling ready to tackle this beast of a book. And I thought, well, I got to go to the CAMH archives. I mean, if he worked at Queen Street, there's got to be something there. So, but at the same time, I wasn't feeling confident about writing this book because all I had was his external achievement, but I had no sense of him as a man. His inner life was a mystery to me. Very few letters survived. And so I'm just going to, so I said to myself, I need to make some kind of discovery, like a cache of letters or something, and you get what you wish for. So here's the day when I walked into CAMH in 1995. Those of you who know Cyril, the late Cyril Greenland, he was the man who dropped this on me. As the archivist handed me a folder marked FitzGerald, I held my breath. Inside, I found 60 intense confessional letters written by my grandfather in 1939-40, the last year of his life. He was languishing in a private sanitarium in Hartford, Connecticut, being treated for depression in the wake of a failed suicide attempt. The letters were addressed to his close friend, Dr. Clarence Ferrer, the thin cerebral director of the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, a forerunner of the Clark Institute, where, ironically, a generation later, my father was drugged and shocked into submission. Ferrer had died in 1970 at the age of 95. The letters had been donated to the archives that very week. The very week I walked in there, the letters had been donated. They'd been sitting on a shelf for 40 years somewhere. They'd been donated by Ferrer's second wife, a woman over 40 years, his junior. To describe my discovery as coincidental seemed a desperately inadequate explanation. Deciphering Jerry's semi-illegible scrawl, I strained to digest the feast all in one sitting. Even as a vice-like pain encircled my skull, in the corridors outside the archives, the strangled cries of medicated patients echoed like the soundtrack of a Gothic horror film. The letters had been written a decade before my birth, yet the tone and idiom seemed so familiar, real, immediate. The distant, unknown stranger who had occupied the haunted house that was my body was suddenly made flesh before my eyes, the past bleeding freely into the present, his soul laid bare before me with a near unbearable pathos and vulnerability. The Lamentations of My Grandfather, calling from the end of the 1930s, uncannily mirrored the voice of my father at the end of the 1960s. The same slow slide into midlife crisis, the same anguished outpourings over the reversals of fortune, the loss of income and status, the upsurgings of panic and self-loathing, the helplessness, the hopelessness, the terror of being second-rate, the paralyzing indecision about whether or not to return to work, all chased by unrelenting thoughts of self-annihilation. The pair of drowning voices thrashed inside my head, fusing and confusing, making no distinction between the separate identities of Jerry and Jack, father and son. In fact, as the voices drilled and swirled and lashed, they awakened a third voice, the sound of my own primal dread. My grandfather's words were pulling me back to the austere Victorian nursery on Balmoral Avenue, the desert of hardwood floors where small children, generation upon generation, are abandoned under the wheels of the repressed. I felt part of some weird trinity of Father, Son, and unholy ghost. It was falling to me, the third generation eldest son, to stand and fight. I was able to obtain my grandfather's clinical files from Hartford. And here I learned he suffered 57 rounds of insulin shock. This was a brand new experimental treatment in the late 30s. It was later discredited, but even its inventor, Manfred Sackel, admitted that it was akin to medieval torture, convulsions, sweats, comas, and he had 57 of these. And roughly 5% of all insulin shock patients died on the table, never came out of the coma. So here we have this incredible irony, here's the man instrumental for mass producing insulin for the world's diabetics, and he's kind of a bit of a guinea pig for this treatment. And I mean, if I had submitted my book to Random House as a novel, they wouldn't have accepted it. This is too over the top, James. Truth will always remain straighter than fiction. So in his letters to Dr. Ferrer, Jerry obsessively repeats this phrase over and over again. When he's getting the insulin shock, he gets this point where he says, "I have committed the unpardonable sin, and the penalty is death." This really got my attention. What does he mean? I mean, he was a secular Protestant doctor. He wasn't actively religious. At one point, he asked to see a Catholic priest, and presumably to vent and confess his sins, real or imagined, but they won't let him. And Ferrer once declared that the four horsemen of the apocalypse were communism, unionism, Catholicism, and psychoanalysis. Pretty much covers the basis, In other words, talking is verboten. I found those letters in 1995, as I said, and my father had died 3 years earlier, and if I had taken the letters to him, I know what would have happened. He just wouldn't have been able to handle it. He spent the last 20 years of his life alone in a one-bedroom apartment on lithium, sort of flatlined, a kind of death in life, and he just couldn't go there. And so I gave up trying, as tactful as it could be. It's too painful. I always say I've interviewed hundreds of people in my life as a journalist, and my father remains by far my worst interview. So that the immunologist immune to his own son. So then I approached my mother and I showed her the letters. I said, "What do you make of this?" And she read them and she said, "Well, they're pretty repetitious, aren't they?" And I said, "Well, I think that's because no one's listening to him." And at one point, the psychiatrist, they kept changing the labels, but at one point they said he's paranoid. And certainly he was in a disturbed state, but he was quite lucid. And his paranoia, as it were, was I'm a loser and failure and I should be taken out and shot. And I've let down the side. He's the dean of medicine and I should be World War II had started and I should be at the front like a man fighting like I did in World War I. But more crucially, my peer group, banding and best, are not visiting me. They're judging me. And he actually was correct about that. That's what it was like to be a man in 1940. This is an unpardonable sin. And so then my mother suggested I talk to Dr. John Hamilton, who I showed you earlier, who was my father's tutor at Cambridge. And he said, he's in his 80s now, he's out in Vancouver. He's one of the last guys alive who knew your grandfather. And I bet you he knows something. So I flew out there in 96, I think. And at first he wouldn't talk to me. I just knew he knew something, but it was this hauntingly familiar experience like my father, And so I went away and I went back a second time and I just sort of almost demanded. I said, listen, I'm the grandson. I'm entitled to know. I think there's been a cover up here. Something's been sanitized. And sure enough, then out comes this shocking revelation. And I remember feeling this calm come over me. Like it was like, thank you. It's very liberating. I had been right. I've been right from the beginning. This kid knew something's not right here. And so I was very grateful to Hamilton for telling me that. And at the same time, it liberated many levels because it sort of, now I understand my father's silence and the silence of the medical profession too, for that matter. But I could now kind of forgive, and now I get it. And also, now I knew I had a book, which was very different. Now I know the story. Now I can tell the story. So those of you who have read the book will know what that is. Those of you who haven't, I hope will read it. So before I end, you'd be on the receiving end of what it's like to be withheld from, right? Just make a few final comments about what I've just given you. This is obviously a story of sort of the stuff of Greek tragedy. I mean, my father and grandfather were kind of Icarus figures, aren't they? I mean, they're these reaching for the sun and then crashing to earth. And my grandfather, who from all accounts was a remarkable man, sense of humor, charming, everybody loved him. But he had this, savior complex, and he really ended up in this trapped and isolated place that, no matter what you do, you're never good enough. It's always the voice. And he couldn't enjoy the fruits of his labor. I think it took me a while to realize this, but both men were really unusual for their times in the 30s and the 60s because they were men and they were doctors and they sought help, which is pretty unusual. Now, being human, they also resisted the help. And the complicating the fact was that, as I say, they were doctors, and doctors do not make for good patients, as we know, generally. But I also think they resisted. It's all in the files. They resisted for good reasons. I think it's fair to say that my book captures in excruciating detail an iatrogenic fiasco. The exact same mistakes were made consistently over 2 generations. I mean, their fates, it didn't need to play out the way it did. I mean, the lack of therapeutic imagination, the failure to see the big picture here was really spectacular, stunning. I mean, I think of a quote what comes to mind is a quote from the British psychoanalyst Adam Phillips, who wrote a book called Equals, which I really recommend. And the first sentence of this book is, if the best thing we do is look after each other, then the worst thing we do is to pretend we are looking after each other, when in fact we're doing something else. And he's referring, of course, to the powerful unconscious forces in all human relationships, not just therapeutic. And I have come to strongly believe that all professional caregivers must keep asking themselves the same question over and over again, year after year. Why am I doing this for a living? And if the answer comes back, well, I want to do good, or I want to help people, that's not enough. You got to dig deeper than that. Really examine your motives. And just recently, I came across a paper called "The Dedicated Physician," written by Harold Searles in 1967. And this is right around the time my father was cracking up. And he said, words to live by, quote, it is paradoxically the very physician most anxiously concerned to keep the patient alive who tends most vigorously at an unconscious level to drive him to what has come to seem the only autonomous act left to him, namely suicide. And I think this insight, it applies precisely to my father and grandfather's plights. In the early stages of my book, I thought, my story is really extreme. It's off the charts. Like it's really, unusual, anomaly. And then I started to see that, well, wait a minute, the suicide and addiction rates among doctors and physicians is twice the national average. And among medical students, it's 3 times. And so it's kind of axiomatic now that, the psychiatric profession and helping profession generally attract the troubled healer. And yet, today, contemporary training does not require any deep self-examination. I'm not talking about academic examination, but it's no longer, this is voluntary now, it's no longer required. And so I think it needs to be said at this point, I am now addressing an at-risk population, this group here. I mean, it's easier for us to say, in the press, the First Nations and what a mess they are, I'll look at all that suicide and addiction. And but it'd be much harder to address it, let alone acknowledge it within an elite group. And this is certainly my case, with my experience with Upper Canada College, and this is ongoing challenge because it's incumbent on the elites to be the leaders in this field and really look at this honestly. Now there are encouraging signs in the media. Now there have been more stuff coming forward that's quite encouraging, but I still have some criticisms of that too. But we can hopefully get a minute to that. But it's only a few years ago a chief of psychiatry of a major Toronto hospital jumped off a building, and he was on antidepressants at the time. And this kind of drives home the fact that these problems aren't going away. This is grandfather 1940, 2012. His suicide was not reported in the media. There was a cone of silence. And I have this the collective thought that remains unspoken is, if the best of us, if the elites are losing it, where does that leave the rest of us? And that explains the silence, I think. And I think the educational role of the media is critical here. I mean, I've worked in the media, and I have my own problems with the media, but I mean, there has been more stuff, I must say. But I mean, recently the Globe and Mail did a 12-part series, which was excellent as far as it went. But the average reader reading that would go away thinking that the only person in the world qualified or equipped to help someone in emotional distress is an MD. End of story. That is just, it's just rife in the media. And this is simply not true, it's needless to say. And I think, when I read stuff in the media, I still hear this mantra of, depression is a brain disease or an organic illness, like always. I mean, that's what the discourse is. You rarely hear about a more nuanced discussion about an environment or the influence of the family or other possibilities. And so, I think a good example is I think of Bob Ray, who recently came forward and said, when he was in university, he had a crack up and therapy turned him around. And so it's really good of him to come forward and say this because, I mean, he's risking being stigmatized, right, isn't he? I mean, was Bob Ray mentally ill? But that's the thinking out there. That's the risk that's attached to it with this use of this language. And, ideally, I like to think that someday down the road, we'll reach the point where, we can start, the culture at large will stop depathologizing, a temporary life crisis like Bob Ray's or everyday human suffering, making these distinctions between extreme disturbance and milder forms of disturbance. And yes, medication saves lives, there's no question about it. But it's not always the first and best option, then that, we don't have to be crazy to talk to somebody. A few weeks ago, Paul Kurdiak and I had a lovely free-flowing lunch conversation about a lot of these issues, and Paul sort of threw out this wonderful fundamental question, and he says, what is a psychiatrist? In the 21st century, it's a good question to ask. He said, is he a brain doctor? Is he a psychopharmacologist? Is he a therapist? There's all these possible hats, and there are a lot of reasons, largely economic, why the psychodynamic model that I profited from is not part of the CAMH system, and that's understandable. The challenge then becomes, in the future, can the art of psychotherapy work hand in hand with the hard science, all this exciting new stuff that's coming out. That they, ultimately I see them as compatible, but I think there's still an enmity there. And a writer once said, "Art disturbs, science reassures." And I think, but hopefully they can work together. I mean, obviously hospitals do an incredibly admirable job saving people in extreme crisis, and saving lives are being saved. And TGH saved my father's life. And but then there's this long-term question: after they're stabilized, then what? Where do they go? Next stage. What happens? What's possible here? And I really believe, and I can again talk about myself and people like me, that if they meet the right person at the right time, that crisis is an amazing opportunity for regeneration and growth and change, and as like Bob Ray went through. Look at Bob Ray. And here's the final point I would make. Here's the sort of the rub, I guess, that I think it's the very professional caregivers, the people in this room that are clinicians in training and in practice, those of you who are dedicating your lives to helping these people, working under extremely stressful conditions, and as I said, or you're at risk, you're the ones who stand to benefit the most from an in-depth psychotherapy, yourself. You're ultimately doing yourself a favor, and you're doing your clients and patients a favor. And some of those stats will start to come down, the addiction and suicide rates in both populations. And at the last point is, as you may know, next year in 2013, the Ontario government is regulating the profession of psychotherapy. There's a new college. Up till now, it's been technically unregulated. So this strikes me as a golden opportunity to expand and reinvent the channels of referral among and between these groups. And I know firsthand that there's some excellent farm systems out in the city orbiting CAMH. Just to mention a few, there's the Canadian Association of Psychodynamic Therapy, and under that umbrella, there's the Center for Training in Psychotherapy on DuPont. That's the particular I can recommend, because that's the one I benefited from. And opening up the dialogue. And with the birth of the new college next year, I live in hope that there'll be new bridges built. So I'm just going to end by saying, in my wildest dreams, I never pictured myself standing here in this institution 40 years later, 40 years after my father was here, losing his mind and soul next door. And so I'm really grateful for the chance to be seen and heard. Back then, I just didn't have the voice. I was in a trance. And I feel I have the voice now, obviously. And I've learned an incredible amount over that span of the decade, this odyssey I've been going, this ongoing odyssey. And I suppose if I had to say what's the single most important thing that I've learned, I'd say if a truth sets us free, it's largely because we've allowed ourselves to be disturbed by it. So thank you for listening.